name is Alexandra Vacru, and I'm the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Thank you so much for joining us today in what's going to be a very fun conversation with one of my favorite subjects, the Muppets. We're here to talk with Natasha Lance Rogoff, an American television producer, filmmaker, and journalist who's produced television news and documentaries in Russia, Ukraine, and the former Soviet Union. She's also an associate fellow at Harvard University's Art, Film, and Visual Studies Department. Lance Rogoff executive produced Ulitsa Sesame, the Russian adaptation of Sesame Street, between 93 and 97. And in addition to her television work, Lance Rogoff has reported on the Soviet underground culture for major international media outlets. Today, she creates current affairs videos and is the CEO and founder of an edtech company. She's an associate fellow at Harvard University's Art Visual Studies Department and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts and New York City. And most important today, she is the author of a fantastic new book called Muppets in Moscow. To warm up the audience, we're going to start with the trailer for the book, which I think is going to put you all in exactly the right mood for this conversation.
Is to create a program that has never existed here before, which introduces children into the world of learning in a very joyful way and makes them understand that they can achieve anything that they want to do in the future.
Have to share something. Let them share not Terminator, not Rambo, which is now the case, but Sesame Street.
All right. Well, that definitely puts me in the mood. Whoops, one second. Let me stop that video.
Mr. Paul Pelosi, who was...
Sorry. So, Natasha, you cover so much in this book, not only about the Muppets and an incredible cultural adaptation, but also about what it was like to be an American working first in the Soviet Union and then in Moscow in the 1990s, and trying to convince some very creative and artistic people who had never experienced American television or capitalism or democracy to come along with you on this incredible adventure. So maybe you could set the stage for us, how this idea came about and how you got the initial project off of the ground.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. And apologies for the technical issues with the video clip, but we will provide it to you later on the link. I was tapped to executive produce Sesame Street in Russia, which is called Ulitsa Sesame, by the nonprofit company Sesame Workshop, which was then called the Children's Television Workshop in about 1992. And it was a complete surprise to me because I had literally had zero experience in children's television. So the executives from the workshop showed up at a screening of the film that I had just finished called Russia for Sale, which had I had embedded with fascists who were trying to retain control the Soviet Empire. They wanted to prevent the failure of the Soviet Empire. So the Sesame Street execs came to that screening in New York City and said, could you help us bring Sesame Street to Russia? And I asked them, did you just watch my film? Because this film is, rather dark and I don't know anything about children. And they said, well, why don't you just come and meet with us? And then the one of the executives, Gary Nell, said, come on, who can say no to Elmo? And so I went down there, and that was the beginning of a remarkable experience. The project was so ambitious, and Sesame Street had bipartisan support to create a Russian program. Then Senator Biden had actually spearheaded congressional support for the program. But it was also, we didn't have a lot of money. And so the challenges about, trying to bring this show to the former Soviet Union and adapt it in a way that would be culturally sensitive and reflect post-Soviet values was a real challenge. So that's kind of how it happened. And then it took 5 years to actually get to the production and the actual broadcast.
So let's talk about that question of the post-Soviet values, right? Because that's one of the most interesting issues about the 1990s, is there was such a vacuum once communist ideology vanished kind of from the daily scene, and people were really looking to understand what those new values would be. Well, what was your experience with finding people who could relate to what you were talking about, or who were eager to talk about? Was there a lot of resistance to some of the ideas? Well, how did you go around finding the consensus that you would need among the team in what those values would be?
It's a great question. And I would say at first, in a rather bumbling way, but I could rely on Sesame Street's model, the production and research model, where one of the first things that you do, a cornerstone of any international co-production, is bringing together the creative team with educators. And in the case of Russia, we brought in educators from across the former Soviet Union to decide what this new educational children's show should teach, post-Soviet society, family and children. And there were a lot of tensions and misunderstandings in the beginning. What was most fascinating about that is that the cultural differences really touched every aspect of the production, from not only developing the content of the show, the educational goals, but also what the set was going to look like, how the scripts would be written, and the music, and even the Muppets, the design of the Muppets themselves. So, what were these new Muppets going to look like? And, Sesame Workshop does not just import a program, we adapt it. So the tensions that you were talking about, Alexandra, are related to all kinds of concepts such as a free market. How do you teach concepts of a free market in a new society? What are idealistic values that are acceptable in that society? How do you discuss inclusivity, race? So there were, if you take the first in that, for instance, we were all talking about with the educators in a curriculum seminar that was set up, a 3-day seminar inside the Danilov Monastery, which is the headquarters of the Russian Orthodox Church. And we were able to get space in that facility. And it's massive, fortress with whitewashed walls and very intimidating in some ways, but really beautiful. with all these onion dome churches, and it dates back to the 13th century. Ivan the Terrible had visited there. So that was kind of weird, like thinking about walking in his footsteps. And basically it was like we had rented a room in the Vatican.
Right.
So as we're all throwing around ideas about, what values and skills would be in the children's TV show that could be transferred to children so that they could thrive in an open society. And I, raised my hand and suggested, well, what about a scenario where children are running a lemonade stand? That would teach counting and team building skills. And I didn't mention, profit.
Yeah.
I just left that out. But at the same time, the reaction to this was just horror. I thought I was being sensitive by leaving out the profit line. But then the educator said, that would be shameful to show children selling things on the street, because, in Soviet times, the only people selling goods on the street under communism, for the most part, were criminals or mafia. So, that was one example. Another example was when we were showing, many of the educators were not familiar with the American show, with Sesame Street. So the best way to familiarize them with the content was to show short video clips that were dubbed into Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And we showed one clip of a little boy in a wheelchair who was flying a kite with a friend, and there's an upbeat song in the background, me and my chair, we go everywhere. And after we finished playing this clip, the one mathematician stood up and said, that would be exploitative to show children in wheelchairs. And another person said, someone else said, very, innocently, why would normalnie дети, normal children, ever want to watch a TV show with nenormalnie, not normal children? So at first I was really taken aback, first of all, not only by using the words, not normal to refer to children with disabilities. And I really wondered if, these enlightened educators were ready for Sesame Street. And it was kind of, this moment that was sort of disheartening. And then, this one woman said, you Americans don't understand that many of our children will never, ever have a wheelchair, that, our country has collapsed. Look at it. Look at what's happened with our healthcare system. And many of these children, are trapped in their beds. And what if they see children with wheelchairs on the TV show? They'll just feel sad. So I hadn't really, thought about that. And there was still more discussion about how to handle this situation, because, of course, the objective was not to make children sad from watching Sesame Street. Mm-hmm. And then this woman, from the back of the room speaks up and says, I come from this town, in a region stretching from the Urals to Siberia, the town Chuvash, and I work with children with disabilities every day, and they long to play with normal children. Mm-hmm. So she asked the group, why can't you write scenarios where these children are, portrayed, depicted as human and have value in society? She says, the region where I live was used as a dumping ground for hazardous chemicals during the communist era. So we have many children. We have the highest rate of children with deformities in our region. So after she speaks, I look around, and the people who had spoken earlier are kind of fidgeting in their chairs. And then some of the group I look and they're crying. And that is, the kind of experience where, you start in one talking about something, where you think you understand what's going on and how you're going to help to change things for the better in a country, but at the same time, trying to understand where the country's coming from in terms of their own history, as well as their current situation. And during this, by the end, watching what was going on, I also had this feeling of like losing it. I'm going to lose it now. And, I went outside, and we took a break, and I went down to a duck pond in the courtyard of the monastery, and was really thinking about what had happened recently to in our production. And we had lost our broadcast partner, who had been my confidant and advisor in terms of how to navigate the TV industry. And this was Vlad Listyev, who was a great man trying to bring press freedom to Russia and deal with corruption inside the TV station. And he had been assassinated a while earlier. And before that, one of our sponsors, because we had to match the funding from the US show with Russian equivalent funding. And because Sesame Street was a nonprofit, so, it wasn't flush with money. And so what happened is his car was blown up, and he was nearly killed in the car bombing. And I had been in that car 3 weeks earlier. So somehow this discussion with Ludmila, her name was Ludmila, just, made me aware of how numb I had become in some of these discussions. And suddenly I didn't feel numb anymore. Suddenly I felt what people were feeling in that room, which was incredible pain, as well as humiliation about what was happening to their country, and their sense of impotence, they want to make a great TV show that's going to uplift their children. And how do we do that, but also take into account the context that people are living in?
So how did you bring the group around, or how did it bring itself around to kind of accept the sorrow and the trauma of the moment, and find something that was going to help the children get through it and get beyond it?
It was absolutely fascinating to see the transitions taking place. And I think about that now in terms of how do you transition autocratic countries to open societies, and how do you help them, and what is the process that works? And in that case, I didn't have to do anything. Ludmila had done it. She had cast a spell on everybody in the room, and the group had a consensus about how to address this, and they decided to include children with disabilities in the show. Mm-hmm. And this process went on over and over again, related to music, related to, in terms of the music, we during the audition process, we auditioned about 160 children who had come from all over the former Soviet Union. And this was a big deal for most of these families, because a job like the one we were offering to be in the television show would change their lives, not only the child's life, but, the poverty was quite extreme at this time. And so, they would have a living, they would be able to earn a living. And when we went to these auditions, which were held in Gorky Film Studios, at that time, most of film production was dark because the state had previously been supporting film production and there wasn't any money for that. So we were able to bring in some of the most talented, amazing directors and set designers from both film and from theater to work on the television series because of that. Otherwise, these people wouldn't have been available. And at this event, you know, I was most excited because this is where, you know, children sing. And I thought that's my favorite time. I love auditions. And so I'm sitting with the directors and the children come in one by one and they're separated from the other children. So they can't hear what they're each singing. And the first boy comes in, who, you know, these are young kids, and he sings this song called, it was from Bieloruski Vokzal, which was a film. I'm trying to see if I can find the words that he sang. He sang a song about World War II. Here it is. He drops his voice several octaves and sings in a booming alto. Birds don't sing here. Trees don't grow here. It's only the front. The planet is burning. Our motherland is covered in smoke. So he finishes his, you know, presentation. The director thanks him. And I'm sitting here going, okay, that's really, really strange because this is a children's comedy show. And I'm kind of sitting there expecting to hear like Itsy Bitsy Spider or Old MacDonald's Has a Farm. So I think, okay, that's strange, but, you know, let's just see what happens. And then a little girl comes in and she starts singing a song from Katusha, which is a melancholy Russian folk song about a woman who bids her lover farewell as he marches off to the front. And so there's a series of children that come in and they're singing about loss, death, and war. And I'm just like, okay, this is like, how are we going to make this TV show with this music? I mean, I'm just sitting there getting more and more nervous. So then at lunchtime, I go out with the director and I'm like, hey, what's up with this? You know, is this you know, why are they all singing these really morose songs? And he goes, you don't understand, Natasha. These are not morose. These are poetic and lyrical. And I said, yeah, but we're a comedy show. And like Sesame Street is famous for its, you know, diverse, upbeat music. And the idea is that we're going to bring in a lot of young musicians who had been persecuted under communism and they weren't allowed to record their music. Their music was banned, you know, those rock and roll people. I had made a film earlier about rock around the Kremlin earlier for ABC. And so I thought this would be a great way to open it up and you could give all these people jobs and also it would help the show make fantastic music. So he said, this is Volodya, the chief director. He said, look, these songs are the songs that the children sing with their grandmothers. These are the songs that bring them comfort. And we want to include these in our show. So that was another aspect of the cultural clash that existed. I mean, that goes on, you know, if you read the book, you know, you see what happens eventually. But
can we give a little bit of a reveal?
Sure.
So I want to share my screen here because I have a picture of one of the main characters.
Yes. He wrote it. This is Sasha, or
well, first I want to show Katya, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe you can explain who she is and why she was important.
So Katya was the music director of the show and a very, very talented concert pianist and composer. And her initial reaction to seeing the American show, clips from the American show, was that the Ulica Sezam should have only classical music, and that we should, in the show, showcase Russia's great classical tradition and not have any modern music. So that was a battle that went on for quite a long time. And eventually, if you read the book, you see what happens there too. But eventually this show had the most incredible music. And the story about Katya and how she changed her mind is incredibly entertaining, because she meets Sasha Skliar, who is the lead singer of Vabank, who is was a rock and kind of heavy metal guy. That's him. And on the left. And he was also a close friend of mine from the 1980s, when I lived there and was a student, and later a journalist in Moscow. So Sasha actually wrote one of the best songs for Ulica Sezam, and it's a song about washing hands, and we're going to show you a tiny clip.
Руки помой, вымывану не забудь о другой. Руки помой, тише, чаще, чаще.
So,
he has a broad range for sure.
look at that deep voice, is, and when Katya first met him, she just couldn't imagine that this guy who sang like, heavy metal, he was kind of like a heavy metal version of Tom Waits. And he used to smoke papyrosi, these tar laden cigarettes, in order to make his voice even deeper before concerts.
But she came around, and they also came around to the idea of the Muppets, right? I mean, there's quite an interesting story about kind of the history of puppets in the Soviet Union, right? And how the Muppets, which were very un-Russian or un-Soviet, were going to fit into that tradition. I have a picture of some of the Russian Muppets, which are, as you expect, Muppet looking. Let's see if I can find it here.
Yeah.
And maybe you can say a little bit about that question.
Sure. Well, that's Zelibova in the center. That is a blue hound-like character who's a little bit taller than Big Bird. He's a full body puppet. And on the right is Kubik, who is a kind of a nerdy character and a sort of a ne'er-do-well. He comes up with inventions. He likes to invent things that he doesn't know that they already exist, like a clothing line, like a clothesline. And Businka is she's a very excitable, ball of fire, who is kind of mischievous. And both of the smaller puppets are hand puppets, hand and rod puppets. And the story of the creation of the Muppets reveals a great deal about the society and about, concepts of Russian pride and history. Just touching a little bit on that, initially when we proposed the Muppets, the reaction of the creative team was, we don't want to use your Muppets because we have a very long revered puppet tradition dating back to the 16th century. So we want to use our puppets, and their puppets were mostly wooden, hardwood. They weren't comfortable with the foam and sort of rounded features of the Henson style Muppets. And as one colleague said, our puppets wear clothes. They're not naked like yours. So, but the process of the Muppets as well, the design of them was so cool because, they really went back to their folklore traditions and thought about what did they really want. And the idea for the full body Muppet was based on Domovoy, the character who's kind of a evil looking guy with a flashy face, but he's also he's very powerful and omnipotent and the protector of hearth and home, as well as being very tied to nature and spiritual. So this Domovoy character evolved over time into, from a kind of like authoritarian figure who told children what to do to a childlike, goofy tree spirit who lives in a tree and can smell music. So very abstract, fun character. And that character became hugely popular in the, all across the former Soviet Union, across 11 time zones. Children love him. And when I meet people today, from Russia and the other former republics, and I ask them, do you know Zeliboba? What do you think? And they're like, oh, I love Zeliboba. A lot of them will like start singing some of the songs from the show. So it's really, it's really wonderful how each of the Muppets, the Slavic Muppets, really reflected the culture, and they just have their own aesthetic that is very, very Russian.
I think that comes across if you look at the set. I have a couple of the pictures from the set. And maybe you can describe, I mean, obviously this doesn't look like Sesame Street in New York, right? There are some very sort of touching adaptations. And maybe you could describe a little bit how those came about.
Sure. The set is magnificent. I mean, we worked with over 400 Moscow artists, set designers, puppeteers, writers, producers. To create this set, it was quite a challenge because the set designer Masha Rabasova, who was an extremely successful theater set designer, this was her first TV series that she was working on. But she said, I have a dilemma because I'm not sure what the set should look like aesthetically. Should it reflect pre-revolutionary Russia? Should it reflect our recent Soviet past? Or should it be something new that we don't even know what it is yet for new Russia? And, what should it look like? So it was really, really quite complicated to figure this out. And for the creative team to decide, what elements of their past society and their future society did they want to include? So one of the issues is that for every Sesame Street International co-production, there's an open space where the puppets, the Muppets, and the human actors can gather. So in South Africa, it's a marketplace. In Mexico, it's a plaza. In Norway, it's a train station. So what was the public place going to be for Ulica Sezam? The group decided eventually, with the help of the research director, that the thwart, the courtyard where people live, would be the ideal place. And this is a courtyard surrounded on all sides by buildings. And then it was a question of what would those buildings look like? And it had to be based in reality. So, the idea of Sesame Street for the set designer is that it's based in real life so that children can solve real life problems, and they're not going to use magic and fantasy in order to navigate solving these problems. So in this case, when we had a meeting discussing what this courtyard would look like, one of the people raises his hand and says, well, if it's going to be realistic, then you have to have broken glass, a rusty car, trash all over the place. And of course, the neighbors have to be reporting on their neighbors to the KGB.
That's helpful.
So, I mean, it was sort of like a, laughing between tears kind of response from the creative team. But the set that was created, which includes the buildings, both from each of the periods, both pre-revolutionary periods, dachas, they also, they wanted to include khrushchevy, these Soviet-style concrete apartment complexes. And the word for these apartment complexes comes from Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and Trushoboy, which means slum. So we had those on the set too. And then we also had pre-revolutionary brick houses, dachas from the rural regions of the former Soviet Union. And they wanted to have both elements because the hope was that the show would be accepted both, in rural parts and urban parts. So they combined all these different architectural elements. And then the coup de force was a scrim, a backdrop that was hand painted with kind of like a Where is Waldo, with images of all the different types of buildings and the churches, and it was magnificent. It had trees and just absolutely beautiful.
I think that's part of it, isn't it? In the background.
Yeah, in the back. That's the scrim.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't. It's much more colorful than that. This is kind of, some of these images are sort of washed out because they're from 27 years ago.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question about this urban-rural divide, because that was something that always fascinated me when I had little kids in Moscow, and we were interviewing for preschool, right, or the last grade before first grade, and they were obsessed that all of these very urban children know the names of all the baby animals, which are quite different in Russian, right? The cat and the puppies and the kittens and all of these things have their own kind of unusual derivations and names. And my kid, who was speaking English and Russian, but never really kind of getting the full-fledged Russian education, like he was better on dinosaurs and planets than he was on baby animals, which is really kind of, baby animals are not something that you usually encounter when you're in cities. And it struck me the legacy of kind of this rural peasant culture was still very much front and present in the Russian educational system, at least for the younger children. And so it's interesting that they were conscious not just of balancing, the audience, like we want kids in the villages to be able to appreciate it also, but how did they deal with that tension between like urban and rural life? That's kind of part of the transformation.
It's so interesting that you bring that up, because actually in the set, there was a whole discussion of what to put in the courtyard as play, elements of play for children. And the initial design had an elephant and a spaceship. And it was absolutely gorgeous, like, down to, finest drawing, colorful drawings. And I remember asking the set designer, and this is in the book as well, and I said, but Russia doesn't really have elephants. And the idea of a spaceship, it was happening at the same time when a lot of the writers, I would say a majority of the writers, were submitting scripts that had escapist themes. So they were all like, we were trying to teach geography, and there'd be a script about a family leaving for France and feasting on foie gras and cheese. And there was another script and everybody was leaving Russia, and we were like, look, we're trying to do a show, for Russia in Russia. And so, eventually the writers shifted that. They understood, what we were talking about. But on the other hand, it made sense. They had been denied the right to travel until very recently. So everybody was really excited about the concept of travel. So this was a similar thing in the set design. And we discussed that together as a group. Do we really want an elephant, with a howdah, thing that you sit in and everything, or is that just a little weird? So what the set designer came up with was magnificent. Little baby animals.
Mhm.
And they found someone from the countryside who carved the animals for the playground. And then it was, the kind of ride that you could sit on.
Like with the spring, right?
With
that
the spring,
rocked back and forth?
exactly, yeah. And that's ended up being what was decided by the team.
Mhm.
So,
Amazing.
yeah.
How did things change? I mean, you did this for a number of years, right? Obviously, the team kind of got the hang of it, and then life changed a little bit. They did travel. They did get, all of this, the Sesame Street, let's not call it indoctrination training, and in how to do the show. Like, did it get easier? Did the plots change? What kind of evolution did you see over time?
So I was there for the first season. I mean, I built the initial production,
Mhm.
and then I left.
Mhm.
And so I don't actually know how the show changed that much. I mean, I've seen other aspects of it,
Mhm.
but the same people that were our team for season 1, they remained with the show, for many, many years. I think for most of them for between 6 and 10 years.
Mhm.
So, they carried through what was started. And the Russian research director, who was integral in designing the content for the show with her team, was there through, until the last year.
And the last year was 2006 when it was shut down, basically. Is that right?
I think it had a secondary airing till 2010. Is
Mhm.
what I understand. It was very difficult for me to find out exactly what happened and how it ended.
Mhm.
But relations between the US and Russia were already deteriorating by 2010. And there was already a consolidation of the TV station and independent press by Putin's regime by that time. And there was an internal issue where they had tried to fire someone on the team. And this was a team that had been together for a very long time. And everybody else was like, that's not okay. We don't agree with that. And eventually there was an attempt to take it over
Mhm.
from the people who had been running it for many years. That's my understanding of how, it eventually was taken off the air.
So looking back at the 1990s and what Sesame Street was trying to do, for children's television, what a lot of World Bank advisors, private consultants, academics were trying to do in economics or in democracy institution building in Russia. And there was a lot of effort to provide Russians with what we thought was kind of the background that they need in order to build these institutions, which we kind of assumed that they wanted, and that people, because they seem to be enamored with the West after not having been allowed to access it for so long, we assume that people wanted to move towards capitalism and democracy, and Sesame Street. And now when I try and understand, like, what was that about? Was it just kind of the release of all of that pressure from the Soviet Union collapsing that led to that openness, which was just kind of like all the energy dissipated and then it was back to kind of some base state for Russia? Or is it that Putin and the political structures kind of generated a new system that again put the lid on all of those sentiments?
That is a huge question.
I know. I think about it all the time. I don't know the answer. I'm just wondering, like,
Well,
what
I have to say,
what
it's
happened?
actually many questions
Huh.
with many different answers, because the periods were so different as the regime changed. And, the first part of your question, which deals with the immediate transition, where the West responded to the collapse of the Soviet Empire with a mad rush. You had a certain sector of the population looking at it as an exciting opportunity for a brand new, big, huge market. So from the capitalist perspective, you had the spiritual people who looked at it as an opportunity to evangelize religion. You had the NGOs and all the people working on democratization, and then you had the government that was very focused on stabilizing the ruble and macroeconomics, as well as, our group, which was soft power, and the role that soft power could play in the transition, in helping the transition. And that's my area. That's the area I was in. All these other areas I was not part of.
Let's talk about
And so,
power then.
when I look at, what happened then, I mean, one of the things I do remember is, first of all, much of the West was euphoric over the collapse of the Soviet Union. This had been our enemy. This is a nuclear superpower. The idea that this battle could possibly be over and Russia was now going to join the free world. I mean, that was historic. It was a historic moment that we were in. And I don't think anybody expected that we would be where we are today then. But there may have been many people, including myself, that expected us to be where we are today much earlier. And part of that is because there was such an impetus, kind of what you're talking about, which is that, we went there and we had a lot of expectations, many of which were naive, not taking into account the history. And that's why I feel like it felt so important to me now to write this book, where we take a deep dive through the prism of making, bringing the Muppets to Moscow and adapting it, where we gain a greater understanding of the history that continues to impact post-Soviet Russia. That we understand the time that it takes for consciousness to change, for values to change, and ideology. It doesn't happen overnight. And so often we in the West keep making the same mistake again, where we go into countries and we're like, oh, tomorrow it's going to mirror our society. Let's just, make that happen. Woo! And that's just not the way it works, in countries where they have long, rich traditions that have to be respected, and you have to work with them. Ulitsa Sesame was one of the most successful programs that came out of post-communist society. This is something that works. It worked for many, many years. And, at this point, I get, when I'm watching these young people who are marching outside of Russia now, the late 20s, 30-year-olds, the people I'm meeting in New York, in Europe, who left Russia recently, many of them grew up on Ulitsa Sesame. I'm having conversations with them, like the woman who was helping me, fix my hair, who's from Georgia, who, well, her children grew up on Ulysses Sesame. And so she was talking to me about, her favorite character and, why she left. And, these are the Sesame Street generation in Russia. And on the Ukrainian side, it's the same thing. The children who are in their late 20s and their 30s now, they also grew up watching Ulysses Sesame. So how much did those values that the Muppets brought to the former Soviet Union were part of that, zeitgeist of creating an openness among the children of that era who are now adults. So there haven't been studies that look at this carefully, but I definitely was wondering, like, did Zelensky see it? Did his children see it? I'm really, these are
We'll find
questions.
out.
Yeah,
We'll find out. But that's what's really great about your book is that, first of all, it does, it highlights kind of the culture clash that comes when there's this attempt to import something that has worked everywhere else. And you're like, oh, well, of course it's going to work here. And they're like, what about Rachmaninoff and his music? And what about Kandinsky and his color scheme? And like, why do you think that like anyone is going to care about the Muppets in 100 years? And I think it's very sensitive to the fact that, it was very complicated because there was a desire for compromise, right? It wasn't just like, oh, everyone loves Elmo. Of course, Russian kids will love Elmo also, right? It was, how do you take the ideas that underpin the Muppets and adapt them for something that has resonance in Russian culture? I mean, that's the point, right? It's supposed to be something that people can relate to. And it is actually possible to find that compromise, right? But it's very difficult, right? And it's very frustrating, and it was expensive, and it takes a long time, right? These things don't happen right away. And we need a lot of that patience, right? Not just in countries where we have difficult relations like Russia, but in a lot of other countries that are going through transformations even now. The Armenia, Georgia, all of those countries have a lot of the lasting effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union that are only now being expressed. And I would love to see a study that showed, if some of the watchers of Ulysses Sesame, childhood watchers, have a different worldview or societal view than children who didn't see them.
Yeah, no, the fact that the show went on for 10 years, well into Putin's era, is amazing. This was hugely successful. And, the people that made that show, our team, they were just, we had some of the most talented, passionate, committed people who really envisioned, creating a show. They envisioned a different Russia, first on the TV screen, and then hopefully in real life. And that's what they envisioned. They thought that we could, with the Muppets, with the set, with the stories we were telling, that we could create it. And it's down to even the language, the choices that we made about language and how people would interact. How do you create kindness, on the set? How do you create neighborliness? And it's not the same. It's not exactly the same as in the American show. It's very much related to their culture.
Well, it's an amazing piece of work. Not only the oeuvre of Ulysses Sesame, but also your book, I think, is really a wonderful look into the 90s, into the creative process, and into the actual execution of soft power and what it means for those who are involved in its production, and also the potential impact that it has. So congratulations on a great book.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think it's what I'm finding now, and especially in talking around the country, is how important it is for people to understand that there are many people, across the former Soviet Union who embrace these ideas and really want a different future for their children and for their country. And not looking at it and saying, oh, well, why aren't these Russians, standing up and protesting? And, it's a police state. And people, who have children and need to feed their children, and, they have to weigh if they should go to jail. And I think that's really important for people to see, where people are coming from, I think.
Well, as in the book, right? It's a call for greater understanding and tolerance, which is very, very well received.
And all in the Sesame Street spirit.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Natasha, for spending this hour with us. I hope everyone enjoys reading the book as much as I did. And it's just been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. And we'll also provide links on the YouTube. So
I think they're in the chat. Yes. And they'll be on the YouTube channel. Great.
Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much
for joining us.